hippies. How could his pure message be heard in such a place? But in San Francisco, Mukunda and others have been working on the mantra rock dance for months. It would draw thousands of young people, and the San Francisco Radha Krishna temple stood to make thousands of dollars. So it was a fundraiser for the San Francisco temple. So, although among his New York disciples, Srila Prabhupada had expressed uncertainty, he now said nothing to deter the enthusiasm of his San Francisco followers. Sam Spirster, Mukunda's friend and one of the Mantra Rock organizers, explained the idea to Hayagriva, who had just arrived from New York.
That's Shyama Sundar, isn't it?
Sam, yeah, I think he's Sam Sundar. So Hayagriva has come to see what's going on. Okay, so he explained to Hayagriva, there's a whole new school of San Francisco music opening up. The Grateful Dead have already cut their first record. Their offer to do this dance is a great publicity boost, just when we need it. But Swamiji says that even Ravi Shankar is Maya, Hayagriva said. Oh, it's all been arranged, Sam assured him. All the bands will be on stage, and Allen Ginsberg will introduce Swamiji to San Francisco. Swamiji will talk and then chant Hare Krishna, with the bands joining in. Then he leaves. There should be around 4,000 people there. Srila Prabhupada knew that he would not compromise himself. He would go, chant, and then leave. The important thing was to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna. If thousands of young people gathering to hear rock music could be engaged in hearing and chanting the names of God, then what was the harm? As a preacher, Srila Prabhupada was prepared to go anywhere to spread Krishna consciousness. Since chanting Hare Krishna was absolute, one who heard or chanted the names of Krishna, anyone, anywhere, in any condition, could be saved from falling to the lower species in the next life. These young hippies wanted something spiritual, but had no direction. They were confused, accepting hallucinations as spiritual visions. But they were seeking genuine spiritual life, just like many of the young people on the Lower East Side. Prabhupada decided he would go. His disciples wanted him to go, and he was their servant and the servant of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda, Sam and Harvey Cohen had already met with the rock entrepreneur Chet Helms, who had agreed that they could use his Avalon ballroom, and that, if they could get the bands to come, everything above the cost for the groups, the security, and a few other basics could go as profit for the San Francisco Radha Krishna temple. Mukunda and Sam had then gone calling on the music groups, most of whom lived in the Bay Area. That means the Bay Area, means San Francisco Bay Area. And one after another, the exciting new San Francisco rock bands, the Grateful Dead, Moby Grape, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service. They had agreed to appear with Swami Bhaktivedanta for the minimum wage of $250 per group. And Allen Ginsberg had agreed. The lineup was complete. In San Francisco, every rock concert had an art poster, many of them designed by the psychedelic artist called Mouse. One thing about Mouse's posters was that it was difficult to tell where the letters left off and the background began. He used dissonant colours that made his posters seem to flash on and off. Borrowing from this tradition, Harvey Cohen had created a unique poster. Krishna consciousness comes west, with letters, using red and blue concentric circles and a candid photo of Swami smiling in Tompkins Square Park. The devotees put the posters all over town. Hayagriva and Mukunda went to discuss the program for Mantra Rock Dance with Allen Ginsberg. Allen was already well known as an advocate of the Hare Krishna mantra. In fact, acquaintances would often greet him with Hare Krishna when he walked on Hate Street. It's not spelled hate, as in hate, love and hate. It's hate, G-H in the middle. And he was known to visit and recommend that others visit the Hare Krishna temple. Hayagriva, whose full beard and long hair rivaled Allen's, was concerned about the melody Allen would use when he chanted the Swamiji. I think the melody you use, Hayagriva said, is too difficult for good chanting. Maybe, Allen admitted, but that's the melody I first heard in India. Does anybody know what that melody is? No?
It's far out.
A wonderful lady saint was chanting it. I'm quite accustomed to it, and it's the only one I can sing convincingly. So he must have sung that melody. With only a few days remaining before the Mantra Rock dance, pictures. Allen came to an early morning kirtan at the temple and later joined Srila Prabhupada upstairs in his room. A few devotees were sitting with Prabhupada eating Indian sweets when Allen came to the door. He and Prabhupada smiled and exchanged greetings. And Prabhupada offered him a sweet, remarking that Mr. Ginsberg was up very early. So here's a precedent for eating sweets early in the morning. Yes, Allen replied, the phone hasn't stopped ringing since I arrived in San Francisco. That is what happens when one becomes famous, said Srila Prabhupada. That was the tragedy of Mahatma Gandhi also. Wherever he went, thousands of people would crowd about him chanting, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai! Mahatma Gandhi ki jai! The gentleman could not sleep. Yes, that is good. No, sorry, I missed that. The line doesn't make sense. The gentleman could not sleep. Well, at least it got me up for kirtan this morning, said Allen. Yes, that is good. The conversation turned to the upcoming program at the Avalon Ballroom. Don't you think there's a possibility of chanting a tune that would be more appealing to Western ears? Allen asked. Any tune will do, said Prabhupada. Melody is not important. What is important is that you will chant Hare Krishna. It can be the tune of your own country. That doesn't matter. Prabhupada and Allen also talked about the meaning of the word hippie. And Allen mentioned something about taking LSD. Prabhupada replied that LSD created dependence and was not necessary for a person in Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness resolves everything. Prabhupada said. Nothing else is needed. At the mantra rock dance there would be a multimedia light show by the biggest names in the art. Ben, Valmita and Roger Hilliard. Ben and Roger were expert at using simultaneous strobe lights, films and slideshows to fill an auditorium with optical effects reminiscent of LSD visions. Mukunda had given them many slides of Krishna to use during the kirtan. One evening, Ben and Roger came to see Swamiji in his apartment. Roger: he was great. I was really impressed. It wasn't the way he looked, the way he acted, or the way he dressed, but it was just his total being. Swamiji was very serene and very humorous, and at the same time obviously very wise and in tune, enlightened. He had the ability to relate to a lot of different kinds of people. I was thinking, some of this must be really strange for this person, to come to the United States and end up in the middle of Haight-Ashbury with a storefront for an ashram and a lot of very strange people around. Yet he was totally right there with everybody. On the night of the mantra rock dance, while the crew set up equipment and tested the sound system, and Ben and Roger organised their light show upstairs, Mukunda and others collected tickets at the door. People lined up all the way down the street and around the block, waiting for tickets at $2.50 a piece. Attendance would be good, a capacity crowd, and most of the local luminaries were coming. LSD pioneer Timothy Leary arrived and was given a special seat on stage. He's very high on LSD at the same time. Swami Kriyananda came carrying a tambura. A man wearing a top hat and a suit with a silk sash that said San Francisco, claiming to be the mayor. At the door, Mukunda stopped a respectably dressed young man who didn't have a ticket. But then someone tapped Mukunda on the shoulder. Let him in, it's all right, he's Owsley. Mukunda apologised and submitted, allowing Augustus Owsley Stanley II, folk hero and famous synthesizer of LSD, to enter with a ticket. The mastermind behind the LSD. Almost everyone who came wore bright or unusual costumes, tribal robes, Mexican ponchos, Indian kurtas, God's eyes, feathers and beads. Some hippies brought their own flutes, lutes, gourds, drums, rattles, horns and guitars. The Hells Angels, dirty-haired, wearing jeans, boots and denim jackets, and accompanied by their women, made their entrance carrying chains, smoking cigarettes and displaying the regalia of German helmets, emblazoned emblems and so on. Everything but their motorcycles, which they had parked outside. The devotees began a warm-up kirtan on stage, dancing the way Swamiji had shown them. Incense poured from the stage, from the corners of the large ballroom. You wouldn't be allowed to do that now, would it be a fire hazard? And although most in the audience were high on drugs, the atmosphere was calm. They had come seeking a spiritual experience. As the chanting began very melodiously, some of the musicians took part by playing their instruments. The light show began. Strobe lights flashed. Coloured balls bounced back and forth to the beat of the music. Large blobs of pulsing colour splurted across the floors, walls and ceiling. A little after 8 o'clock, Moby Grape took the stage. With heavy electric guitars, electric bass and 2 drummers, they launched into their first number. The large speakers shook the ballroom with their vibrations, and a roar of approval rose from the audience. Around 9:30, Prabhupada left his Frederick Street apartment and got into the back of Harvey's Cadillac. He was dressed in his usual saffron robes, and around his neck he wore a garland of gardenias. Anybody, you know those gardenias? I think it's frangipani, something. Very, very fragrant. It was Prabhupada's favourite flower. Super fragrant. They had a garland of those. And the sweet aroma filled the car. On the way to the Avalon, he talked about the need to open more centres. At 10 o'clock, Prabhupada walked up the stairs of the Avalon, followed by Kirtanananda and Ranshaw. As he entered the ballroom, devotees blew conch shells. Someone began a drum roll, and the crowd parted down the centre, all the way from the entrance to the stage, opening a path for him to walk. With his head held high, Prabhupada seemed to float by as he looked through the strange milieu, making his way across the ballroom floor to the stage. Suddenly the light show changed. Pictures of Krishna and his pastimes flashed onto the wall. Krishna and Arjuna riding together on Arjuna's chariot. Krishna eating butter. Krishna subduing the whirlwind demon. Krishna playing the flute. As Prabhupada walked through the crowd, everyone stood applauding and cheering. He climbed the stairs and seated himself softly on a waiting cushion. The crowd quieted. Looking over at Allen Ginsberg, Prabhupada said, "You can speak something about the mantra." Allen began to tell of his understanding and experience with the Hare Krishna mantra. He told how Swamiji had opened a storefront on 2nd Avenue and had chanted Hare Krishna in Tompkins Square Park. And he invited everyone to the Frederick Street Temple. "I especially recommend the early morning kirtans," he said, "for those who, coming down from LSD, want to stabilize their consciousness on re-entry." All these stoned people going to the temple in the morning. Prabhupada spoke, giving a brief history of the mantra. Then he looked over at Alan again. "You may chant." Alan began playing his harmonium and chanting into the microphone, singing the tune he had brought from India. Gradually, more and more people in the audience caught on and began chanting. As the kirtan continued and the audience got increasingly enthusiastic, musicians from the various bands came on stage to join in. Ranshaw, a fair drummer, began playing Moby Grape's drums. Some of the bass and other guitar players joined in as the devotees and a large group of hippies mounted the stage. The multicoloured oil slicks pulsed, and the balls bounced back and forth to the beat of the mantra, now projected on the wall. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. As the chanting spread throughout the hall, some of the hippies got to their feet, held hands and danced. Allen Ginsberg: "We sang Hare Krishna all evening. It was absolutely great, an open thing. It was the height of the Haight-Ashbury spiritual enthusiasm. It was the first time that there had been a music scene in San Francisco where everybody could be part of it and participate. everybody could sing and dance rather than listen to other people sing and dance. Janaki was Kunda's wife, I think. People didn't know what they were chanting for, but to see that many people chanting, even though most of them were intoxicated, made Swamiji very happy. He loved to see the people chanting. Hayagriva. Standing in front of the bands, I could hardly hear, but above all, I could make out the chanting of Hare Krishna, building steadily. On the wall behind, a slide projected a huge picture of Krishna in a golden helmet with a peacock feather, a flute in his hand. Then Srila Prabhupada stood up, lifted his arms and began to dance. He gestured for everyone to join him, and those who were still seated stood up and began dancing and chanting and swaying back and forth, following Prabhupada's gentle dance. Raja Segal. The ballroom appeared as if it was a human field of wheat blowing in the wind. It produced a calm feeling in contrast to the Avalon ballroom atmosphere of gyrating energies. The chanting of Hare Krishna continued for over an hour, and finally everyone was jumping, yelling, even crying and shouting. Someone placed a microphone before Srila Prabhupada, and his voice resounded strongly over the powerful sound system. The tempo quickened. Srila Prabhupada was perspiring profusely. Kirtanananda insisted that the kirtan stop. Kirtanananda stop the kirtan. Swamiji was too old for this, he said. It might be harmful. But the chanting continued, faster and faster, until the words of the mantra finally became indistinguishable amid the amplified music and the chorus of thousands of voices. Then suddenly it ended, and all that could be heard was the loud hum of the amplifiers and Srila Prabhupada's voice ringing out, offering obeisances to his spiritual master. Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Askota Sata Shri Srinad Bhakti Siddhanta Sarasvati Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
Srila Prabhupada made his way off stage through the heavy smoke and crowds and down the front stairs with Kirtanananda and Ranchal close behind him. Alan announced the next rock group. As Srila Prabhupada left the ballroom and the appreciative crowd behind, he commented, "This is no place for a brahmachari." The next morning, the temple was crowded with young people who had seen Swamiji at the Avalon. Most of them had stayed up all night. Srila Prabhupada, having followed his usual morning schedule, came down at 7, held kirtan, and delivered the morning lecture. Later that morning, while riding to the beach with Kirtanananda and Hayagriva, Swamiji asked how many people had attended last night's kirtan. When they told him, he asked how much money they had made, and they said they weren't sure, but it was approximately $1,500. Half audibly, he chanted in the back of the car, looking out the window as quiet and unassuming as a child, with no indication that the night before he had been cheered and applauded by thousands of hippies who had stood back and made a grand aisle for him to walk in triumph across the strobe-lit floor amid the thunder of the electric basses and pounding drums of the Avalon ballroom. For all the fanfare of the night before, he remained untouched, the same as ever in personal demeanour. He was aloof, innocent and humble, while at the same time appearing very grave and ancient. As Kirtanananda and Hayagriva were aware, Swamiji was not of this world. They knew that he, unlike them, was always thinking of Krishna. They walked with him along the boardwalk near the ocean, with its cool breezes and cresting waves. Kirtanananda spread the chadar over Prabhupada's shoulders. In Bengali there is one nice verse, Prabhupada remarked, breaking his silence. I remember, oh, what is that voice across the sea calling? Come here, come here. Speaking little, he walked the boardwalk with his two friends, frequently looking out at the sea and sky. As he walked, he softly sang a mantra that Kirtanananda and Hayagriva had never heard before. Govinda Jaya Jaya Gopala Jaya Jaya Radharamana Hari Govinda Jaya Jaya. He sang slowly in a deep voice. As they walked along the boardwalk, he looked out at the Pacific Ocean. Because it is great, it is tranquil. The ocean seems to be eternal, Hayagriva ventured. No, Prabhupada replied, nothing in the material world is eternal. In New York, since there were so few women present at the temple, people had inquired whether it was possible for a woman to join the Krishna consciousness movement. But in San Francisco, that question never arose. Most of the men that came to learn from Swamiji came with their girlfriends. To Prabhupada, these boys and girls, eager for chanting and hearing about Krishna, were like sparks of faith to be fanned into steady blazing fires of devotional life. There was no question of his asking the newcomers to give up their girlfriends or boyfriends, and yet he uncompromisingly preached, no illicit sex. The dilemma, however, seemed to have an obvious solution. Marry the couples in Krishna consciousness. Because traditionally a sannyasi would never arrange or perform marriages, by Indian standards someone might criticize Prabhupada for allowing any mingling of the sexes. But Prabhupada gave priority to spreading Krishna consciousness. What Indian, however critical, had ever tried to transplant the essence of India's spiritual culture into the Western culture? Prabhupada thought that to change the American social system and completely separate the men from the women would not be possible, but to compromise his standard of no illicit sex was also not possible. Therefore, Krishna-conscious married life, the Grihastha ashram, would be the best arrangement for many of his new aspiring disciples. In Krishna consciousness, husband and wife could live together and help one another in spiritual progress. It was an authorized arrangement for allowing a man and woman to associate. If, as spiritual master, he found it necessary to perform marriages himself, he would do it. But first, these young couples would have to become attracted to Krishna consciousness. Joan Campanella had grown up in a wealthy suburb of Portland, Oregon, where her father was a corporate tax attorney. She and her sister had had their own sports cars and their own boats for sailing on Lake Oswego. Disgusted by the sorority life at the University of Oregon, Joan had dropped out during her first term and enrolled at Reed College, where she had studied ceramics, weaving and calligraphy. In 1963, she had moved to San Francisco and become the co-owner of the ceramics shop. Although she had had many friends among fashionable shopkeepers, folk singers and dancers, she had remained aloof and introspective. It was through her sister Jan that Joan had first met Srila Prabhupada. Jan had gone with her boyfriend Michael Grant to live in New York City, where Michael had worked as a musical arranger. In 1965 they had met Swamiji while he was living alone on the Bowery, and they had become his initiated disciples, Mukunda and Janaki. Swamiji had asked them to get married, and they had invited Joan to the wedding. As a wedding guest for one day, Joan had then briefly entered Swamiji's transcendental world at 26 Second Avenue, and he had kept her busy all day making dough and filling kachori pastries for the wedding feast. Joan had worked in one room and Swamiji had worked in the kitchen, although he had repeatedly come in and guided her in making the kachoris properly, telling her not to touch her clothes or body while cooking, and instructing her not to smoke cigarettes because the food was to be offered to Lord Krishna and therefore had to be prepared purely. Joan had been convinced by this brief association with Swamiji that he was a great spiritual teacher, but had returned to San Francisco without pursuing Krishna consciousness further. So actually Luna, isn't it? So she was already living in San Francisco, Joan Campanella. Okay. A few months later, Mukunda and Janaki had driven to the West Coast with plans of going soon to India, but had changed their plans when Mukunda had received a letter from Swamiji asking him to try and start a Krishna consciousness temple in California. Mukunda had talked about Swamiji to Joan and other friends, and he had found that a lot of young people were interested. Joan had then accompanied Mukunda, Janaki, and a boy named Roger Siegel to the mountains in Oregon, where they had visited their mutual friends, Sam and Marjorie. So Marjorie becomes Malati. So they go and visit Sam and Marjorie. They had been living in a forest outlook tower. Mukunda had explained what he had known of Krishna consciousness, and the six of them had begun chanting Hare Krishna together. They had been especially interested in Swamiji's teaching about elevating consciousness without drugs. Mukunda had talked excitedly about Swamiji having asked him to start a temple in California, and soon he and his wife Janaki, Sam and his girlfriend Marjorie, and Joan and Roger, now intimate friends, had moved to an apartment in San Francisco to find a storefront and set the stage for Swamiji. So Krishna was really arranging that. He arranged for this Joan to come to New York, and then she went back and did part of opening the centre in San Francisco. After Swamiji's arrival, Joan had begun attending the temple kirtans. She felt drawn to Swamiji and the chanting, and she especially liked the informal visiting hours. Swamiji would sit in his rocking chair with his hand in his bead bag, chanting the holy names, and Joan would sit fascinated, watching his fingers moving within the bag. One day during Swamiji's visiting hours, while Swamiji was sitting in his rocking chair and Joan and others were sitting at his feet, Janaki's cat crept in through the hallway door and began slowly coming down the hall. The cat came closer and closer and slowly meandered right in front of Swamiji's feet. It sat down, looking up intently at Swamiji, and began to meow. None of the devotees knew what to expect. Swamiji began gently stroking the back of the cat with his foot, saying, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, are you feeding him prasadam milk? Joan, I was touched by Swamiji's activities and his kindness, even to cats, and I longed for more association with him. Joan came to understand that serving Swamiji was a serious matter, but she didn't want to jump into initiation until she was 100% sure about it. Sometimes she would cry in ecstasy, and sometimes she would fall asleep during Swamiji's lecture. So she remained hesitant and skeptical, wondering, how can I actually apply Swamiji's teachings to my life? One evening, Swamiji asked her, when are you going to be initiated? Joan said that she didn't know, but that she relished reading his books and chanting Hare Krishna. She said that because she was attracted to the mountains and to elevated spiritual consciousness, she wanted to travel to Tibet. Joan suddenly felt that Swami knew everything about her, and she understood, oh, I have to see through his eyes what Krishna consciousness is. He was promising that he would take her to see some very elevated realm, but she would have to see it. It was then that Joan decided to become Swamiji's disciple. I can take you to a higher place than Tibet, he said. Just see. When she told her boyfriend Roger, he was astounded. He and Joan had been coming to the kirtans and the lectures together, but he still had doubts. Maybe it would be good for him, for him and Joan to get married, but not initiated. Joan, however, was more determined. She explained to Roger that Swamiji hadn't come just to perform marriages. You had to get initiated first. So Roger became Gurudas. Okay, we stop there because it's... that's Yamuna, Jones Yamuna. Because Yamuna was married to Gurudas. Okay, we'll stop there. Anybody want to add? Make a comment or...
You know what they did in that forest tower? Shyamasundar and his...
They had to look for fires, no?
Yeah. That was their job.
Just to look for fires.
They didn't do anything.
Just smoking dope or something.
Just smoking dope, yeah.
Growing and smoking.
They were crawling trees. He was crawling trees.
Really?
Yeah, he took LSD and then he crawled to the top of the trees and then he couldn't get down. It's described in Chasing Rhinos.
That's not in here. A lot of things are not actually in the...
It's not so relevant.
Not so relevant. It's very humorous though.
He said when he took LSD, the only thing he could do was to go up. So he would climb the trees.
Literally.
Yeah. He couldn't get down.
Yeah. It could be very dangerous. Huh? I know sometimes people think they can fly and jump out the window because it convinces you can fly. Yeah, I was part of that whole thing. These names of the bands I recognise and this whole LSD culture. I remember all that. I'm old enough to remember it all.
Grateful Dead, they were big. They were huge.
I remember listening to that. Grace Slick was our lead singer, this lady, Grace Slick. I'm sure I wouldn't like it to listen to it now. I don't really like it at all. Okay. Srila Prabhupada ki.
Yeah. There's big forest fires in France now.
I heard there was thousands of people had to run away from their houses.
There's 19,000 hectares of forest burned.
In the south.
I think so. It's called Gironde. They think they can stop it, they can't stop forest fires. It's just nature.
They need the mercy of the spiritual master, the downpour of the mercy of the spiritual master.
The way I understand it, the way nature